In the year 1836, in the bustling port city of Charleston, South Carolina, wealth and power were built on chains and silence. It was a world where mansions gleamed in marble, yet behind their doors echoed the cries of the enslaved. Among them was a girl named Annalise, sold at auction for the sweetness of her voice, a voice her masters believed would entertain their guests. But her hymns carried more than melody. They carried a mystery, a force no one could name, a sound that unsettled even those who thought themselves untouchable. When she sang, fevers rose, hearts faltered, and fear took root in places where cruelty once reigned. To some she was a curse, to others a savior, and to all she became a legend. This is the story of the girl whose song burned through chains, whose voice outlived fire, and whose hymn lingers still in the magnolia groves of Charleston. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The air in Charleston hung heavy with the stench of sweat, tobacco, and salt from the harbor. The auction block stood at the center of the square, its wooden planks worn smooth by the countless feet that had been forced to stand upon it. On this day, among the lines of trembling bodies waiting to be sold, there was a girl whose eyes lingered not on the buyers but on the sky. Her name was Annalise, though few cared to know it. She was slight of frame, her skin the deep brown of river earth, and her hair bound in hurried braids. To most, she looked like any other soul condemned to bondage, yet there was something about her presence that made the murmuring crowd lean closer. When the trader pushed her forward, Annalise did not cry out, nor did she lower her head. Instead, as the man shouted her age and strength, she let slip a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for breath. It was a hum, no more than a thread of melody, carried on the air like a secret. For the briefest moment, the market quieted. The restless stamping of horses ceased, the clamor of coins and shouts dimmed, and all who stood nearby felt a chill at the base of their necks. The trader, oblivious, barked out her price, but among the buyers, whispers began to rise. "Did you hear that?" one man muttered. "Like a hymn," said another. A third crossed himself, though he could not say why. The Whitfield family stood near the front, their silks and polished shoes marking their station. Mr. Whitfield, a planter with ambitions larger than his acres, leaned forward with a curious eye. His wife, pale and stern, pressed a hand to her chest, unsettled by the stillness that had settled over the square. And their eldest son, restless with the arrogance of youth, smirked and said the girl might sing their guests into comfort during supper. With a flick of his father's hand, the bidding ended. Annalise was theirs. Dragged from the block, chains heavy on her wrists, she did not resist. But as the Whitfields turned to leave, she hummed again, low and steady, a note that seemed to seep into the wooden walls and the stone beneath their feet. The crowd parted in silence, watching her pass as though a shadow had crossed the Sunday. No one could explain the unease that lingered after she was gone. All they knew was that the air felt changed, and those who had heard her would never quite forget the sound. The Whitfield plantation rose from the low country earth like a monument carved against time. Its white columns gleamed in the sunlight, tall and cold as sentinels, while marble steps swept upward toward a grand doorway. The house itself was a fortress of wealth, its brick walls wrapped in ivy and its windows trimmed in polished glass that caught the morning light. To the passing eye, it was the picture of elegance, the pride of Charleston society. Yet behind its doors, the shine of marble was matched only by the weight of chains. Annalise was led through the halls by a housemaid, her bare feet moving across floors so clean they reflected her face back at her. She saw paintings of Whitfield ancestors staring down from gilded frames, their powdered wigs and stern expressions declaring a lineage built on ownership and dominion. She smelled beeswax and tobacco, roasted meats and perfume, scents meant to mask the rot beneath. Every corner of the house whispered of power, and every brick had been laid by hands that would never be acknowledged. The parlor was her station, a room of velvet chairs, heavy drapes, and a chandelier that glittered like frozen rain. It was here that Mrs. Whitfield received her guests, and it was here that Annalise was placed, silent and still, to pour tea, to fetch shawls, to stand as though invisible. Her silence pleased them. They mistook it for obedience, for meekness, for the dull quiet of submission. They did not see the thoughts behind her lowered eyes, nor did they notice how her hands lingered near her lips when she was alone, as though holding back a sound. The Whitfield children treated her as a curiosity. The youngest tugged at her skirt, demanding she hum the way she had on the day of her purchase. Annalise only bowed her head, and the child grew bored, running off in search of amusement. Mr. Whitfield regarded her as one might a fine piece of furniture, useful so long as it did not splinter. And Mrs. Whitfield, watching with the sharpened gaze of envy, began to think of how the girl's presence unsettled her friends. For whenever Annalise stood in the parlor, conversations faltered and laughter thinned, as if the very air grew heavier. That night, when the house fell quiet and the candles burned low, Annalise sat alone on the servant's bench near the door. The marble columns outside loomed like pale bones against the sky. She drew a breath, closed her eyes, and let a single hum escape her throat. The sound was soft, yet it lingered, weaving through the halls like smoke. The house of marble did not shift, but something within its walls seemed to stir, as though the chains that bound it had begun to tremble. Evening fell heavy upon the Whitfield plantation, the sky dimming to a violet hush as the last light of day surrendered to the glow of candles. In the great room, the Whitfields gathered for prayer, their Bibles resting in polished hands, their voices reciting the familiar words with the measured certainty of ritual. The servants stood along the walls, silent shadows bearing witness. Among them was Annalise, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly before her. Mr. Whitfield's voice carried the prayer, steady and loud, each verse spoken as though it were a decree. "Mrs." Whitfield answered softly, her tone rehearsed, her eyes glancing more at her guests than at the scripture. The children fidgeted, their patience thin, their small feet tapping restlessly on the rug. The air was thick with candle smoke and the weight of expectation. When the prayer ended, the room fell into the polite quiet that always followed. Then one of the guests, a neighbor with flushed cheeks from too much brandy, leaned back and smiled. He asked if the girl might sing. A murmur ran through the room. "Mrs." Whitfield stiffened, her lips tightening, but her son laughed and clapped his hands. "Yes, let her sing," he said. "We paid well enough for her voice, did we not?" Annalise lifted her eyes. For a moment she stood motionless, as though carved from stone. Then, with a breath that seemed to gather not only air but something deeper, she opened her mouth. The first note drifted out, soft as a whisper, trembling in the candlelight. It was a hymn, but not one the Whitfields recognized. The melody wound slow and low, like a river moving beneath the earth, and every word carried a weight that pressed upon the heart. The room grew still. The restless children froze, their wide eyes fixed upon her. The neighbor with the brandy lowered his glass, his hand trembling. "Mrs." Whitfield gripped the edge of her chair until her knuckles whitened, her breath quick and uneven. Even Mr. Whitfield, so certain in his authority, shifted in his seat as though uneasy in his own skin. Yet none spoke. When the last note faded into silence, they smiled as though charmed. "How angelic," Mrs. Whitfield murmured. "How sweet," another guest added. Their words sounded rehearsed, fragile against the lingering shadow of the song. Annalise bowed her head, her face unreadable, and returned to her place along the wall. But long after the prayer ended, long after the candles burned low, the melody clung to the walls. It seemed to echo in the marble, to seep into the wood, to coil around the very air of the house. And though the Whitfields laughed to one another and pretended to be at ease, none could shake the sense that something unseen had entered with her song, and that it was not leaving. The morning sun broke over the plantation, spilling gold across the fields and glinting off the marble columns of the Whitfield home. Yet inside those walls, the air was not bright with day but heavy with unease. One of the guests who had sat in the parlor the night before, a wealthy planter from Savannah, had risen from his bed drenched in sweat. His face burned red, his body shivered with chills, and every cough rattled his chest as though it might tear him apart. The Whitfields summoned a physician, But even as he pressed cool cloths to the man's forehead and muttered of imbalance and humors, it was clear that the fever was stronger than any cure he carried. The household buzzed with worry. Mrs. Whitfield paced the halls, whispering to her husband that it must have been the oysters served at supper. Mr. Whitfield insisted it was a common ailment, nothing more. Yet the servants watched closely, their eyes drifting not to the sick man but to the girl who moved silently through the house, carrying basins of water and trays of broth. Annalise. They remembered her hymn, the way it had drawn silence like a veil across the room. They remembered how each guest had shivered, though no draught had touched them. And now, one lay stricken in his bed before the day was done. In the quarters, whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Some said the girl's voice was a curse, that her song slipped into the blood and turned it sour. Others claimed it was no curse at all but power, given by spirits older than the chains that bound them. A few spoke her name with reverence, while others crossed themselves and turned their faces away, fearing to meet her gaze. By evening the guest's fever worsened. His groans carried down the halls, breaking the stillness of supper. Mrs. Whitfield kept her chin high, insisting to her company that he would recover by morning. Yet her hand trembled as she lifted her glass, and her eyes flickered toward Annalise, who stood in the corner, silent, her face unreadable. That night, as the house settled into uneasy rest, Annalise sat alone on the servants' bench once more. She did not sing, not even a whisper of sound. Yet in the quiet, the memory of her hymn seemed to stir again, rising like smoke through the rafters. In the sick room, the fevered man tossed and turned, calling out words no one could understand. And in the quarters, the enslaved lay awake, each listening for the faintest trace of her voice, wondering if her silence now was mercy or warning. The servants' quarters stood at the edge of the Whitfield estate, a row of weathered cabins where smoke rose thin from small fires and voices carried softly in the night. Inside these cramped walls, the enslaved carved what little space they could for themselves. Yet among these places of sorrow, Annalise found a room that belonged to no one. It was a narrow chamber at the end of a corridor, its door warped from years of damp air, its floor uneven with boards that creaked beneath the lightest step. Few entered there, for it held no bed, no tools, no reason for use. Dust settled thick upon the rafters, and spider webs laced the corners. To others, it was forgotten. To Annalise, it became sanctuary. She discovered it by chance one evening, carrying linens through the hall. A draught curled beneath the door, and when she pushed it open, the faint light of dusk spilled across the emptiness. She stepped inside, and the silence wrapped her like a cloak. For the first time since the auction block, she felt unseen, unmeasured, uncommanded. She closed the door and sat upon the floor, her hands resting in her lap, her heart beating with a strange, steady rhythm. There, in that hidden room, she let her voice free. It began as a whisper, a low hum that trembled in the dust. The walls caught her sound and returned it to her, fuller, richer, as though the room itself was singing back. She shaped the hum into a hymn, not the polished songs of the Whitfields' gatherings, but something older, deeper, born from memory and grief. Her voice carried sorrow and defiance, longing and prayer, winding together into a sound that did not ask to be heard but demanded it. The servants in the corridor paused. Some pressed their ears to the wall, others held their breath, unwilling to disturb the strange music seeping through the cracks. The hymn rolled like confession, like the telling of sins and secrets too heavy for words. Those who listened felt their chests tighten, their eyes sting, though they could not say why. When Annalise finished, silence fell again. She bowed her head, as though in prayer, though no words passed her lips. Outside, the others whispered among themselves, but dared not enter. The quiet room belonged to her now, and her hymns turned its hollow emptiness into a chapel of shadows. From that night forward, whenever the weight of chains grew too heavy, Annalise returned there. Alone in the forgotten chamber, her voice rose like smoke from a hidden fire, carrying with it a power no one could name, a power that grew each time the walls received her song. The overseer, Silas, was a man feared by all who labored under the Sunday. His whip cracked louder than thunder, and his voice carried the promise of pain. He was a tall figure, gaunt and sharp, with eyes that searched always for weakness. He trusted no one, not even himself, and he carried suspicion like another weapon at his belt. It was Silas who first began to notice the pattern. Annalise moved quietly through the plantation, her head bowed, her hands quick to work, her lips often pressed together as though holding back words. To most, she seemed obedient, perhaps even timid. But to Silas, something about her silence unsettled him. He watched the way others glanced at her when they thought no one noticed, the way conversations ended when she entered a room, and the way her presence seemed to draw an invisible line between calm and unease. One afternoon, a kitchen hand raised her voice against Annalise, accusing her of laziness. The woman struck her with a cloth still damp from scrubbing. Annalise said nothing. She only lowered her eyes and walked away. By the week's end, the kitchen hand was bedridden with fever, her body shaking with chills. Silas heard the whispers. They said the girl's song had touched her, that she carried the sickness in her voice. He dismissed it with a growl, yet the thought did not leave him. Another time, a stable boy mocked Annalise, tugging at her sleeve until she turned her face aside. Days later, the boy's hands swelled with boils, and he could not grip the reins. Silas again heard the talk in the quarters. They said Annalise's silence was dangerous, that she did not need to speak to make her will known. Silas began to watch her more closely. He noticed how she lingered near the chapel door, humming low when she thought no one listened. He saw how those who dared to scold her seemed to falter soon after, struck down by illness, by weakness, by some unseen hand. He told himself it was coincidence, nothing more. Yet each time it happened, the suspicion grew heavier in his chest. One evening, as the sun bled red across the fields, Silas stood near the edge of the quarters and heard her voice drift from a shuttered room. It was no louder than a sigh, yet it carried, curling through the air like smoke. His skin prickled, his fists clenched tight. He spat upon the ground, muttering that he would uncover her trick. But as the hymn faded into the dusk, a shiver crawled down his spine, and for the first time in many years, Silas felt fear. The Whitfield house glittered with light that evening, its chandeliers casting gold across the polished floorboards, its long table laden with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and crystal decanters of wine. Guests from across Charleston filled the parlor with laughter and clinking glasses, their silks and jewels flashing beneath the candles. The Whitfields, proud of their wealth, reveled in the admiration of their peers. Yet amid the splendor, Annalise stood in silence. Her dark eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly before her, as if she were nothing more than another piece of furniture placed for display. The meal lingered long, each course more indulgent than the last. Conversation turned from politics to crops, from family fortunes to whispers of unrest in distant towns. But when the last dish was cleared, Mr. Whitfield leaned back in his chair and, with a smile that carried more command than invitation, told Annalise to sing. The guests echoed his request, their voices eager, their curiosity sharpened by the memory of her hymn spoken of in hushed tones since the last gathering. Annalise did not refuse. She stepped forward, the flicker of candlelight brushing her face, and drew a breath that seemed to quiet the entire hall. Her voice rose soft and steady, a hymn both mournful and radiant, its notes winding like a river through the room. Each word seemed to linger in the air, heavier than sound, as though the walls themselves were listening. The laughter that had filled the house only moments before faded into silence, and every guest sat transfixed. At the center of the table, one master, a portly man with a flushed face and rings heavy on his fingers, lifted his silver goblet halfway to his lips. As Annalise's voice swelled, his hand trembled, his chest tightened, his breath caught, and his eyes widened in sudden terror. With a strangled cry, he clutched at his heart and collapsed against the table. The goblet slipped from his grasp, striking the wood with a hollow clang before rolling to the floor. Wine spilled across the linen, dark as blood beneath the candles. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices shouted. Servants rushed forward. The physician among them called for air, for water, for calm, but nothing could rouse the man. His face turned ashen, his body limp, while the silver goblet lay gleaming at Annalise's feet. Through it all, she did not falter. Her hymn faded into silence, her expression unreadable. Her gaze lowered as though she had seen nothing at all. The guests murmured in fear and confusion, searching for reason in food, in drink, in fate itself. Yet in the quiet corners of the hall, whispers began anew. They said her song had touched him, that the death in his chest was carried on her voice, and though the Whitfields smiled tightly, insisting it was an unfortunate ailment, none at that table could shake the sound of her hymn, nor the shadow it left upon their hearts. Night wrapped the quarters in shadows, the air thick with the smell of smoke from dying fires and the salt of sweat after long labor. The cabins stood close together, their walls thin, their voices carrying from one to the next. It was here, in the hush between dusk and dawn, that whispers about Annalise grew louder than the whip ever could. The enslaved spoke of her hymn as though it were a living thing. They recalled the guest who burned with fever, the stable boy who could no longer use his hands, and now the master who had fallen dead beside his silver goblet. Each story passed from tongue to tongue, reshaped and colored with awe or dread. Some swore her voice carried sickness, that she was marked by dark spirits who bent to her command. Others said it was no curse but a gift from heaven itself, an answer to the cries of their people, a weapon hidden in the frail body of a girl. Around the fire, men and women argued in low tones. One warned that her song would bring ruin to them all, that the Whitfields would lay the blame at every back and make them suffer for what they could not control. Another answered that her voice was their only hope, that at last someone carried power greater than chains and whips. The children listened wide-eyed, their hearts torn between fear and wonder, repeating her name like a secret prayer. There were those who avoided her gaze entirely, crossing themselves or muttering charms when she passed. Yet there were others who sought her out in the shadows, kneeling close and whispering their pleas. They begged her to sing for them, to lift her voice against the overseer who struck without mercy, to bring sickness to the mistress who delighted in cruelty, to turn her hymn toward those who ground them down each day. Some even asked her to sing death upon their own suffering, to ease their pain when no other mercy came. Annalise listened but seldom spoke. Her silence was an answer of its own, though none could say what it meant. In the dark of the quarters, her presence became larger than life, a figure both feared and revered. To some she was a curse walking among them, to others a savior sent in flesh, and when the night grew deepest, when the fires sank to embers, a faint hum sometimes drifted from the quiet room where she hid herself away. The sound curled into the air, carrying both sorrow and strength, and every soul who heard it knew they were caught between terror and hope. For Annalise's hymn had become more than music. It had become legend. The fever crept through the quarters like a shadow that would not lift. It began with a child, no more than 6 years old, her small body racked with shivers, her breath shallow and uneven. Her mother knelt beside her bed of straw, wiping sweat from her brow with trembling hands, whispering prayers that carried no strength against the sickness. The others gathered near the doorway, watching with faces heavy as stone. They had seen fevers before, and they knew the cruel hand it dealt. That night, the air was thick with grief before the child was even gone. The mother rocked back and forth, clutching her daughter, whispering to her, pleading for her to hold on. Yet the girl's eyes fluttered, her lips dry, her breath no more than a faint rattle. The room felt colder with each sound she made, as though death had already stepped inside and waited patiently in the corner. It was then that Annalise entered. She did not speak, nor did she ask permission. She knelt beside the straw bed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes resting gently on the child's face. For a long moment she sat in silence, the room hushed as though the world itself held its breath. Then, slowly, she began to sing. Her voice was not the thunderous hymn that had shaken the halls of the Whitfield house. It was softer, fragile as a thread, a lullaby that seemed to rise not from her lips but from the air itself. The notes curved low, tender and mournful, carrying sorrow but also peace. Each sound wrapped the child like a blanket, easing the strain in her small chest. The mother pressed her hand to her lips, her tears spilling silently as she listened. The fever did not break. The child's breaths grew slower, her small hand loosening in her mother's grasp. Yet there was no struggle, no final gasp of pain. Instead, her eyes closed gently, and she slipped away as though carried on the current of Annalise's song. Death came quietly, almost kindly, and the room felt strangely lighter, as if the hymn had guided her spirit to a place beyond suffering. When the lullaby ended, silence filled the quarters. The mother bent her head over her child's body, weeping, yet her sobs carried not only grief but gratitude. Those who stood at the doorway looked at Annalise with new eyes. She was no longer only the girl whose song brought fear and sickness. She had given the child peace when no mercy could be found. From that night forward, the whispers changed. They still spoke of her power, still trembled at her voice, but now some called her gift a blessing as well as a curse. And in the darkness of their bondage, hope stirred faintly, carried on the memory of a lullaby. The Whitfields held fast to the belief that religion could keep their slaves obedient, and so they brought a preacher to the quarters each Sunday. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a booming voice, speaking of obedience and sin, of heaven earned through submission, of damnation waiting for those who resisted their masters. His sermons echoed like thunder in the wooden chapel, but few believed his words brought light. One Sunday, after the service ended, the preacher's gaze fell on Annalise. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the unease among the Whitfields themselves. The stories of her voice had reached even his ears, and though he dismissed them as superstition, something unsettled his heart. With a stern expression, he called her forward. The quarters grew still. Men and women lowered their eyes. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Annalise stepped into the preacher's shadow, her face calm, her hands folded before her. The preacher studied her, searching for signs of evil, for the marks of the devil that his teachings promised would be plain to see. Yet her eyes held no fire, only a quiet sorrow that seemed deeper than words. "Child," he said, his voice hard, "they say your song brings sickness. They say your hymn carries death. Tell me, do you sing for God, or do you sing for the devil?" His question cut through the silence, his words sharp as the crack of a whip. Annalise did not answer. She stood in stillness, her silence heavier than any denial or confession. The preacher grew uneasy, his hand tightening around his worn Bible. He pressed her again, demanding the truth, his voice rising with urgency. Still, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she began to hum. The sound was soft, so gentle it seemed barely a voice at all. It floated upward, fragile and tender, like a prayer carried on the wind. The hymn was no grand song, no command of power, but a simple melody filled with longing, sorrow, and mercy. It filled the chapel with warmth that no sermon had ever brought. The preacher's voice faltered, his sternness crumbled. He felt the hymn pierce through the armor of his words, cutting deeper than fear or doctrine. His eyes burned, his throat tightened, and before he could stop himself, tears spilled down his cheeks. He bowed his head, clutching the Bible to his chest, overcome not by wrath but by grief. When the hymn faded, silence remained. The preacher said nothing more. He turned away, broken by a truth he could not name. And for the first time, those in the quarters saw him as a man, not a master's mouthpiece. Annalise had not spoken a single word, yet her song had spoken for her, and it was louder than any sermon. The Whitfield house stood tall in Charleston, its marble columns gleaming in the sun, its chandeliers glittering with wealth. Yet behind the splendor was a heart of bitterness, and none carried it sharper than Mrs. Whitfield. She was a woman accustomed to being admired, her gowns stitched from silk, her presence meant to command attention. But whispers have a way of slipping through walls, and soon she could not ignore them. Guests who once marveled at her dresses or her table settings now leaned together to murmur about another. They spoke of Annalise, the girl with a voice that could silence a room, the servant whose hymn made even the hardest men pause. They called it angelic, a sound too pure for her station. And each word of praise, each sideways glance, cut Mrs. Whitfield like a knife. Jealousy festered in her heart. She began to notice how her guests' eyes drifted when Annalise was near, how the hush that followed her song was greater than the applause that ever followed the mistress's playing on her polished pianoforte. What had once been a curiosity now grew into a wound, a reminder that no riches, no jewels, no grand displays could summon the same reverence as one girl's voice. One evening, unable to bear the whispers any longer, Mrs. Whitfield summoned Annalise to the parlor. The lamps burned low, casting shadows across the velvet curtains. She sat upright in her chair, her fingers tight around the armrests, her lips pressed thin. Annalise entered quietly, her eyes lowered, her steps measured. "Sing," the mistress demanded. Her voice was sharp, brittle with envy. "Not for the guests, not for the men who drink and flatter themselves. Sing for me, and me alone." Annalise hesitated, her silence stretching into the dim room. The mistress's eyes narrowed, her envy sharpening into suspicion. At last, Annalise parted her lips, and a melody rose. It was not the grand, sweeping hymn that had unsettled the house before. It was softer, a private song, carrying with it the ache of loneliness, the hush of night, the weight of sorrow no finery could disguise. Mrs. Whitfield listened, and for a moment she felt her jealousy dissolve into something else, something she dared not name. The song held a mirror to her heart, revealing the emptiness beneath her pride. When the final note faded, she found her hands trembling, her breath uneven. Yet envy does not die so easily. She clapped her hands once, too sharply, as though to cut the moment in half. "That will do," she said coldly. But in her heart, the bitterness burned hotter than before. For she knew she could demand Annalise's voice, but she could never own what it carried. And that truth gnawed at her more than silence ever could. The night was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and pressed down on every breath. The quarters had fallen into uneasy quiet when Silas, the overseer, came striding through the dirt with his whip coiled at his side. His face was twisted with anger, his voice rough with command. He called Annalise out into the open, his words slicing through the darkness like the lash he carried. "Sing," he barked. "The mistress demands it. The master demands it. You will not defy them, not while I stand." Annalise stood with her head bowed, her hands at her sides. The moonlight caught her profile, calm and still, as though carved from stone. She did not move, did not answer. Her silence was sharper than words, and it stoked the overseer's fury. He struck her once across the back, the crack of the whip splitting the night. Gasps rose from the shadows of the quarters, but none dared step forward. Again he demanded her voice. Again she gave him silence. The whip came down a second time, then a third, until her skin burned and her body trembled. Yet her lips did not part. Her silence became defiance, and her defiance a shield. At last, exhausted from his rage, the overseer left her crumpled in the dirt, muttering curses as he vanished into the darkness. That night, while the others lay restless, Annalise sat alone in the shadows. Her back burned, her breath came shallow, but she did not cry out. Instead, she began to hum. The sound was faint, fragile, a thread of melody woven into the night. It carried no triumph, no vengeance, only sorrow deep enough to break the heart of heaven. Her song rose like smoke from a dying fire, soft and steady, as though each note was stitched from her own pain. The quarters listened in silence. No one dared move, but every ear caught the sound. The hymn slipped through the cracks of the cabins, through the branches of the trees, and into the still air of the plantation. By morning, news spread like wildfire. Silas, the overseer, was found dead in his bed. His body was cold, his eyes wide with terror, his lips curled as if he had tried to cry out but found no breath. Whispers filled the quarters, growing louder than the whip ever had. Some said her voice had struck him down, that the hymn had reached into his chest and stilled his heart. Annalise said nothing. She bore her wounds in silence, but the hum of the night lingered in every memory. From that night forward, her silence was no longer weakness. It was power. The overseer's death was the death of silence, and in its place rose a song that none could chain. The river ran dark beneath the moon, its surface shifting like liquid glass. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the steady croak of frogs. A chorus of night that masked the movements of men. Two enslaved brothers, Samuel and Jonah, crept to the edge of the quarters where shadows stretched long and deep. Their eyes burned with desperation, their bodies hardened by toil, their hearts restless with the weight of chains they had never chosen. They had heard the whispers of Annalise's gift. They had seen Silas, the overseer, carried lifeless from his bed. And though fear wrapped their bones, hope pushed them forward. That night, as the others slept uneasily, they approached her. Their voices shook as they begged her to sing, not for sorrow, not for mercy, but for freedom. "Let your song carry us," Samuel whispered. "Let it break them long enough for us to run." His brother nodded, his hands clenched as if in prayer. Annalise looked at them with eyes deep as the river itself. She did not promise, nor did she refuse. Instead, she led them silently toward the water's edge, where reeds bent low and the air smelled of damp earth. There they knelt, waiting, listening for the footsteps of the patrols that circled the fields. The dogs barked faintly in the distance, their chains rattling. Escape was folly, they all knew, yet the brothers clung to her presence as if it were a shield. When the night grew still, Annalise closed her eyes and began to sing. Her hymn rose low and heavy, flowing like the current itself. The notes drifted across the water, curling through the trees, carrying sorrow and weight that pressed into the night air. The sound was mournful, almost too soft to be heard, but it reached far, slipping unseen into the ears of those who stood guard. The men by the riverbank, rifles in hand, began to falter. Their bodies weakened, their heads bowed, as though sleep had seized them all at once. Some clutched their chests, others slumped against trees, their strength dissolving like mist in the rising moonlight. The dogs, restless at first, whimpered and lay still. Samuel and Jonah exchanged one last glance with Annalise. No words passed between them, only the quiet fire of understanding. Then, like shadows, they vanished into the swamps, swallowed by reeds and water. By dawn, the patrol found their men collapsed and groaning, their rifles fallen useless at their sides. The brothers were gone, the earth leaving no clear trail. In the quarters, whispers spread once more. Annalise had sung, and for the first time, her voice had carried not death but escape. Her hymn had opened a path, and with it, the first crack in the chains that bound them all. The Whitfield house had never shone brighter than on the night of the governor's arrival. Lanterns lined the grand driveway, their flames flickering against marble pillars and polished windows. Inside, servants rushed with silver trays, filling goblets with wine and arranging platters of meat glazed and steaming. The air smelled of roasted pheasant and candle wax, but beneath the fragrance lingered the iron weight of fear. For the master and mistress demanded perfection, and all knew what failure cost. The governor of South Carolina arrived in fine carriage, his coat embroidered with gold thread, his face stern yet weary. He was a man used to deference, to rooms bending to his will. But when he stepped into the Whitfield parlor, all eyes shifted not to him but to the girl in the corner, silent and still, her head bowed. Guests leaned together, whispering her name, recounting the tales that trailed her like smoke: the overseer dead in his bed, the guest who fell sick, the mistress who demanded private songs. Mrs. Whitfield, her voice sweet as honey yet edged with iron, announced, "Governor, you must hear her. Our Annalise sings with the voice of heaven itself." She beckoned the girl forward, her smile strained, her eyes watchful. The governor waved his hand, dismissive at first, but curiosity tugged at him. He had heard rumors carried from Charleston to Columbia, whispers of a song that unsettled even the proudest masters. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Let her sing then." The room stilled. Forks rested. Glasses were lowered. Even the servants paused in their steps. Annalise stood at the head of the table, her small frame cast in the glow of the candelabra. For a heartbeat she did nothing. Her silence itself a weight upon the room. Then, slowly, she opened her mouth. The hymn rose low, tender at first, curling through the air like smoke. It carried sorrow so deep it seemed carved from the bones of the earth, yet it lifted with strange beauty, notes trembling like light upon water. Her voice filled every corner, pressing into every ear, sinking into every chest. The governor's hand began to tremble. His face paled, his lips pressed tight. He gripped the table as though to steady himself, his knuckles white. Whispers stirred among the guests, but none dared speak above the song. When the final note faded, silence struck harder than thunder. The governor rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. His eyes darted about the room, wild and haunted. He muttered prayers beneath his breath. Words of deliverance, of protection, of warding off unseen spirits. Refusing the wine, refusing the feast, he demanded his carriage at once. By the time the wheels rolled down the lantern-lit drive, the governor's face was ashen, his voice unsteady, and those who remained at the table sat in uneasy silence, for they knew they had not witnessed a performance, but a reckoning. Annalise's song had shaken even the highest seat of power. Charleston thrummed with whispers, louder than the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, sharper than the creak of sails in the harbor wind. In drawing rooms and taverns, at church steps and market stalls, the same question spread like smoke. What power did the Whitfields' servant girl hold? Ladies in lace gloves leaned close to one another, their voices hushed but urgent. Some swore it was poison. They said Annalise must be slipping powders into wine, herbs into stew, venom into the very air that hung about her master's table. They remembered the guest who had collapsed mid-meal. The overseer struck down without wound, the governor himself leaving pale and trembling. Poison, they insisted, was a woman's weapon, and though she looked meek and silent, her eyes carried too much knowing. Others scoffed at such notions. Poison? They muttered over their pipes and tankards. You cannot poison a man with a hymn, they spoke instead of witchcraft, of old curses carried from distant shores, of dark bargains whispered in tongues they did not understand. They recalled the way her voice bent the room, how even the proudest men bowed their heads as though unseen hands pressed them low. Was it not said that the devil was a musician, that he played his fiddle to lead souls astray? Perhaps this girl was his vessel, her song the snare to catch the mighty and drag them down. But there were a few, too few, who spoke differently. These were the ones who had heard her hum in the shadows, who had seen the way her lullaby carried a child gently from life to death. To them, her voice was not curse nor poison, but prayer. A prayer too raw, too holy, to be clothed in scripture or owned by preachers. It was the cry of sorrow turned into music, the grief of chains given wings. And because it came not from books nor pulpits, the city feared it. For prayer, when born of pain, carried a power no master could command. The rumors wound themselves around Charleston like vines, each twisting tighter than the last. Housewives warned one another never to drink from a Whitfield cup. Planters muttered that the Whitfields had brought ruin upon themselves by keeping such a dangerous girl beneath their roof. Ministers preached sermons laced with warnings, declaring that false angels walked among them, that the devil could wear the mask of light. Yet behind closed doors, some confessed in softer tones that when they heard of her hymns, their hearts ached with longing. They wondered if perhaps God had chosen a slave to speak the words the proud could never bear. The Whitfields themselves could not escape the weight of rumor. Guests who once clamored for invitations now hesitated at their gates. Servants in neighboring houses repeated stories until they grew into legend. And Annalise, silent as ever, moved through the halls with eyes lowered, though every step she took seemed to ripple like a stone cast in still water. Poison or prayer, witchcraft or blessing, none could agree, Yet all felt the same uneasy truth stirring in their bones. Her voice was not easily named, and what cannot be named cannot be controlled. And so the city watched, fearful and spellbound, waiting for the next note to fall. In the quarters, fear had become as common as breath. Whispers of Annalise's gift spread not only as hope but as dread. Some saw freedom in her hymns, others saw death walking in the shape of a girl. For every man who dreamed of escape, there was another who lay awake at night, fearing the lash, fearing the punishment that might fall upon them all for the sins of one. Among them was Elias, a man bent by years in the fields, his back scored with scars that never healed. He had seen overseers break men for less than rumor, had watched whole families torn apart for a single act of defiance. When he heard the whispers of Annalise's song, he felt no stirring of faith, no glimmer of hope. He felt only terror that her power would draw the wrath of the masters upon them all. In his heart he convinced himself that betrayal was not treachery but survival. Better one girl silenced than an entire quarter burned to ash. One night, as the moon hid behind clouds, Elias left the cabins and crept toward the great house. He stood at its doors trembling, his words heavy on his tongue, his breath shallow with guilt. When at last he was brought before Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, he bowed low, his voice quaking as he spoke. He told them of her hymns, of the fever and the fainting, of the overseer found dead. He told them the slaves believed she carried power in her voice, a power that killed without knife or poison, and with each word, he felt the noose of betrayal tighten around his soul. The Whitfields listened, their faces pale beneath the lamplight. Mr. Whitfield's jaw tightened, his hands clenched as though around an invisible throat. Mrs. Whitfield, her eyes gleaming sharp as glass, leaned forward with something that was not surprise but confirmation. They had felt it themselves, the unease when she sang, the chill that crept into their bones. Elias's words gave voice to what they already feared. "She is a danger," Mrs. Whitfield whispered. Even God's house could not break her. Her envy had curdled into something darker, a hatred sharpened by fear. Mr. Whitfield nodded grimly. Then she must be silenced, permanently. They spoke not of punishment, not of whips or isolation. Their voices carried the weight of finality, the intent of death. Annalise was no longer a servant in their eyes. She was a threat, and threats must be destroyed. Elias left the house that night with silver pressed into his palm, but the coins burned like fire. He told himself he had saved the quarters, that his betrayal had bought safety, yet when he passed the quiet room where Annalise sometimes hummed to herself, he could not bring himself to look inside. For though he had traded her life for his fear, he knew deep within that he had betrayed more than one girl. He had betrayed a song that carried both mercy and defiance, a song that might have carried them all. In the great house, the Whitfields began their plotting, their whispers cold and sharp as knives. And in the quarters the air grew heavier, though Annalise did not yet know the shadow that now followed her every step. The cellar beneath the Whitfield house was a place of damp and darkness, where air hung heavy and the stones wept with moisture. It was here that Annalise was taken, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her ankles shackled in iron. A gag was pressed between her lips, tied cruelly at the back of her head so that not even a word could escape. The Whitfields believed at last they had stripped her of her weapon. They left her there among barrels of spoiled grain and rusting tools, a lantern flickering faintly before the door was slammed shut. The lock turned with a final click, sealing her into silence. At least, that was what they thought. But silence was never truly silence with Annalise, for even gagged, even bound, her voice found a way. It began as a faint vibration in her chest, a sound so low it was barely more than a breath. The gag muffled her, pressed her lips shut, but still the hum rose, steady and stubborn. It slipped into the stones around her, seeped into the wooden beams overhead, curled through the cracks where the cellar met the earth. Upstairs, the Whitfields dined, their voices tense, their laughter brittle. Yet even as silver clinked against goblets and knives scraped across plates, a strange unease crept into the room. The air seemed thicker, harder to swallow. A tremor passed through the chandeliers, so faint it might have been dismissed as wind, but there was no wind in that sealed hall. The servants heard it first, those moving through corridors with bowed heads. A vibration in the floorboards, a tone that brushed against the edge of hearing. They paused, unsure, then hurried on with fear quickening their steps. Soon, even the Whitfields themselves could not deny it. The sound was not loud, but it was everywhere, under the table, in the walls, inside their very bones. A hum that rattled teeth, that made the wine taste bitter, that seemed to come from within as much as without. In the quarters, the enslaved stirred from restless sleep. Some sat up in their straw beds, clutching their chests, eyes wide with awe. They knew the sound, knew it as surely as they knew their own heartbeat. Annalise was singing, though no chains could free her lips. Her hymn traveled not by air but by marrow, not by tongue but by spirit. The Whitfields rose from their table, pale and trembling. Mrs. Whitfield pressed her hands over her ears, but still she heard it deep inside. Mr. Whitfield staggered to the door of the cellar, his keys shaking in his fist, but he dared not open it. He feared what might meet him in the dark. And still Annalise hummed, bound, gagged, beaten into silence. She filled the house with sound. It was sorrow and defiance bound together, a song too deep to be contained. Her captors had sought to chain her voice, but instead they had given it walls to echo against, a chamber to amplify its power. The night stretched long, the house restless and shuddering. And in the cellar, the girl in chains sang without words, her hymn seeping into every corner, into every heart, a reminder that even gagged, even silenced, she could not be undone. The night began like any other, thick with the weight of heat and silence. The Whitfields had retired to their chambers, the overseer's boots no longer pounding the dirt, the quarters hushed with the uneasy quiet of exhausted bodies. Yet beneath it all there was another sound, soft and steady, like a river beneath the earth. Annalise was still humming in her chains. The tone drifted through the cellar stones, pressing upward into the house above, slipping outward into the night. No one could say when the first flame caught. Some whispered it leapt from a lantern, knocked too near the drapes. Others that it sparked from the hearth where the Whitfields had left their fire untended. But those in the quarters believed something else, that Annalise's song, woven with sorrow and rage, had summoned it. Fire, after all, was only another kind of voice, one that roared where she could only hum. The blaze began in the great hall, licking its way up the curtains and racing along the polished wood. Within moments the Whitfield house was alive with crackling light, smoke curling against the ceiling, choking the air. Masters and mistresses staggered from their beds, their shouts drowned by the roar of rising fire. The overseer, half-dressed, cursed as he fumbled for water, but every bucket was too small, every hand too late. From the cellar, Annalise felt it, the warmth creeping through the stones, the smoke snaking through the cracks. Still bound, still gagged, she lifted her head and hummed. The sound mingled with the fire's crackle, carried on the heat until it seemed the very flames were singing with her. Her hymn rose above the panic, a steady note threaded through the chaos. In the quarters, the enslaved stirred to the sight of orange light against the night sky. They saw the smoke curling high, the sparks falling like stars. Some trembled in fear, for fire had always meant punishment, but others felt the stirrings of hope. Doors were left unguarded in the chaos, chains unmonitored, pathways suddenly open. They fled into the dark, some clutching children, others carrying nothing but their breath and their will. The Whitfields screamed for control, for order, but their voices were swallowed by the fire. The mistress staggered into the yard, clutching her jewels against her breast, her face blackened with soot. Mr. Whitfield bellowed commands that no one obeyed. The overseer collapsed coughing, his face pale in the glow. All the while, the humming never ceased. Some swore they could hear it rising above the fire, guiding their feet through the smoke, pulling them toward the woods beyond the fields. It was not a song of despair but of deliverance, a voice reminding them that even chains could break, that even silence could burn. By dawn, the Whitfield plantation was ash and ruin. The house that had once stood proud in marble and cruelty was nothing but smoldering beams and blackened stone. The masters had fled or fallen, their power broken like the glass goblets melted in the wreckage. And somewhere beyond the reach of firelight, the servants know the free moved deeper into the dark forest, carrying with them the memory of a voice that had sung through chains and flames alike. The night of fire was not simply an ending, it was a beginning, And in the heart of it all, Annalise's hymn lingered, unbroken, unburned. When dawn broke over Charleston, it did not rise upon marble or chandeliers but upon ruin. The Whitfield plantation, once paraded as a symbol of wealth and order, lay smoldering and silent. Ash clung to the air like a second skin, and the chimneys stood jagged as tombstones against the sky. Servants who had fled through the night dared to creep back at a distance, their eyes searching the wreckage for signs of who had lived, who had died, and what had become of the girl whose voice had lit the spark. Among the ruins, no body of Annalise was found. The cellar where she had been bound was collapsed in on itself. The stones cracked and blackened, the air thick with smoke. The overseer's remains were there, twisted and charred, and the mistress's shawl lay half-burned in the debris. But of the girl, there was nothing. Not a bone, not a scrap of cloth. It was as though the fire had swallowed her whole. Whispers spread like the smoke itself. Some said she had perished, consumed in the very blaze her humming had called forth. They spoke of her as a martyr, her life given so that others might walk free through the night. To these voices she was gone, yet her sacrifice burned brighter than the fire ever could. But others swore otherwise. They claimed that as they fled into the swamps, they heard a sound threading through the trees. A low hymn, faint but steady, rising above the chirr of insects and the rustle of reeds. They told of a figure glimpsed in the distance, walking barefoot along the water's edge, her hair unbound, her steps neither hurried nor afraid. Some said she moved with the smoke itself, vanishing when the light touched her, reappearing when the shadows deepened. Stories multiplied with each telling. One man claimed she had been carried by spirits, lifted from the fire like a child born on unseen arms. A woman swore she had seen Annalise kneeling in the swamp mud, her hands resting on the head of a dying man, her voice guiding him gently into peace. A boy whispered that she had grown wings of ash and flown over the cypress trees, her song echoing in the still waters below. The masters who survived dared not speak her name. To them, she was a ghost they could not cage, a terror they could not whip, a memory that would rot their nights with dread. They muttered only of rebuilding, of restoring order, yet none dared step near the ruins where the cellar had been. For those who had fled, she became more than flesh. She became a story carried across rivers, whispered at night in hidden camps, told to children as both warning and hope. Some called her a curse, others a saint, but all agreed she had not been destroyed. Fire could not silence her. Chains could not bind her. Betrayal could not end her. And so Annalise vanished. Yet she was everywhere, in the hush of the swamps, in the murmur of the trees, in the trembling of those who remembered her hymn. Whether she lived or walked among the dead, none could say, but her song remained, lingering like smoke, proof that she had been, and perhaps still was, more than any master could contain. Years passed, and the ruins of the Whitfield plantation sank into the earth. Vines wrapped around the blackened stones, grass grew where marble once gleamed, and the wind carried only silence across the land that had once been filled with whipcracks and hymns. Charleston rebuilt itself, its streets filled again with the clatter of carriages and the murmur of markets, but the memory of the fire and the vanishing of the singing girl did not fade. It settled into the bones of the city like a shadow no sunlight could erase. Children born long after the flame still heard her name in whispers. Mothers leaned close to restless little ones at night and hushed them with warnings. "Do not wander past the magnolia groves," they said. "Do not follow the sound in the dark, for if you hear a hymn where no singer stands, it may not be a blessing. It may be her. Annalise, the girl who sang her masters to death, the girl who burned but did not burn, the girl who vanished into the swamps." Some told the story as a caution. They spoke of her as a restless spirit, doomed to wander the earth, her voice a lure for the foolish. They said her hymn carried death still, that those who paused to listen too long would find fever in their veins or shadows on their lungs. Men on hunting trips swore they had heard it, soft as a breeze, curling through the cypress trees, and each man returned paler than he had left, unwilling to speak of what followed. Others, though, told it as a promise. To them, Annalise was not a ghost but a guardian. They said she walked with the lost, guiding the weary through the swamp, her voice a lantern no flame could match. Runaways whispered of her hymn leading them toward safe ground, of hearing her song just as hounds closed in, only to find their pursuers struck weak and coughing behind them. To these voices, she was no curse. She was deliverance. Charleston society never spoke her name aloud, yet they felt her all the same. Governors and preachers prayed longer in their pews, their voices rising louder as though to drown out something unseen. Ladies drew their curtains tight at night, swearing they heard faint music rising with the magnolia scent. Planters muttered that fire and fever had ruined better families than theirs, and in those mutters was always the fear of a song they could not master. The legend grew until it no longer belonged to one girl but to the land itself. Annalise became both mercy and judgment, both shadow and light. She was a hymn that carried through time, reminding Charleston of the fire that had once reduced marble to ash and chains to nothing. And still, on certain nights when the air is thick and the magnolia blossoms open wide, people pause and listen. For in the dark, beneath the rustle of leaves and the cry of owls, there drifts a sound low and haunting, a voice without a body, a hymn without an end. Some cross themselves and hurry home. Others close their eyes and let the sound wash over them. The warning remains the same, whispered from mother to child, carried from hearth to hearth. Never follow the song in the dark, for her hymns belong to no master, and her voice carries both mercy and death.